Hey, what's up makers and Harry Potter fans? Today I'm gonna show you guys how I built this Deathly Hallows inspired display shelf, where I can proudly display my Harry Potter swag. Let's get started. I didn't want to spend much money on this project, so I picked out some walnut live edge offcuts and boards with sapwood that I probably wouldn't use for larger projects. Since I'm using epoxy resin to join the live edge pieces together to make 3 boards of the same width, I had to first clean up the live edges by removing all of the loose material to get a good surface for the epoxy to stick to. Next, I straightened out all the individual pieces on my jointer and then used that surface as reference to flatten out the other side on my planer. After cutting the pieces down to the same length, I laid out and cut some 3/4 inch MDF to make the form for the epoxy pour. I then covered up all the sides with some sealing tape to prevent the epoxy from sticking to the form later. And I'll have links to all the materials and tools I used for the build in the descriptions below. After putting the form together using some brad nails, I sealed the inside corners with silicone. When it came time to mixing the epoxy resin, of course I take the opportunity to add in some green pigment to represent my favorite house. I also added in some silver pigment, hoping to create a Patronus look, but that didn't quite pan out since I already poured too much green. On another board though, I added in some gold pigment to show some love to the Gryffindors. While the epoxy cured in the form, I used a circle cutting jig to cut some rings out of MDF. First, I set up the router to cut the outer diameter by taking several passes, plunging it deeper with each pass until the cut was complete. And then I moved the router toward the center to cut the inner diameter. Here, I used the first ring that I cut to trace out a second ring that's slightly bigger, so that after gluing them up, I can easily flush them up using a router, which is a lot easier than trying to cut the second ring to the exact dimensions as the first. After the epoxy has cured, I used a pry bar to remove the epoxy pieces from the form and sent them through the planer to clean up all the surfaces. And then I took it over to the table saw to cross-cut all the pieces to their final dimensions while cleaning up the edges as well. Next, I needed to cut the 30-degree miters on each end of the board so that they'll form the 60-degree corners of the equilateral triangle after glue up. To accomplish this on the table saw, I must set the blade to its complementary angle, in this case it's 60 degrees, and then make the cut with the board vertical like this. So you'll want to make some type of jig like this, which will fit over your fence and clamp the workpiece down on a large vertical surface. After running the piece through, it'll get you the exact angle that you're looking for. Before calling it done, I added a slight bevel on the edge of each board to add a little bit more character to the triangle. The glue up for the triangle is pretty straightforward, but it's important to use a jig to keep the clamping pressure perpendicular to the glue surface. I'll have a link to these clamping blocks in the descriptions, but you can also make your own from the offcuts. After the glue has had some time to dry, I began laying out the cross-lap joints that will connect the vertical piece to the triangle. One problem with cutting these joints was that I couldn't do on a table saw with my dado stack because of the size of the triangle. So I ended up cutting the joint using my hand saw, and in hindsight I realized I could have made these cuts easily with a track saw, but hindsight is always 20/20. And unfortunately, one of the cuts in the vertical piece also had to be cut by hand. Because the angle of the cut was at 60 degrees and its position on the workpiece would have caused my miter gauge to be unsupported by the table saw top for most of the cut. After having cut 3 slots using the handsaw, it really made me appreciate my dado blades. But for someone who's never cut joinery by hand, the 2 pieces somehow came together pretty nicely. After those pieces were glued up, I began laying out a bunch of dados in the ring to accept the triangular sub-assembly. And just a heads up, it's not your eyes playing tricks on you if you think that the ring looks really thick in these next few shots. What happened was I originally made a 2-inch thick ring, but after realizing the proportions just weren't right, I cut away 3/4 of an inch so that the final ring came out to be 1¼ inch thick, which looked much better. Hope that clears up any confusions, or maybe I just brought attention to a detail that would have otherwise gone unnoticed. Either way, the build process remains unchanged. I covered up the dados with tape to prevent the glue surfaces from getting contaminated by the spray paint I'll be applying in the next step. While the paint dried, I sanded the triangular sub-assembly down and then taped up the glue surfaces before applying an oil finish to it. This is where the magic happens. The oil finish really brought out the colors of the wood and the epoxy. At this point, I really fell in love with the contrast and colors of this piece. Once the paint and the finish have dried, I removed the tape from the glue surfaces and glued the parts together. Alright guys, if you enjoyed this build, please go ahead and hit that thumbs up button and let me know in the comments below. And if you haven't already, feel free to hit that subscribe button to stay up to date with my latest videos. If you'd like to see more content from me, give me a follow on Instagram at Bevelish_creations, link in the descriptions below, where I post regularly about what I'm working on, the tools I use, or just some fun shop content. And thanks for watching guys, and we'll see you next time.